With that, I want to introduce our first speaker, and I'm very, very pleased to announce that Dr. Jerry Glover will address the audience first. And there, I think, I boiled it down to three things you should know about Dr. Glover. First, he's a senior Sustainable Agriculture Systems Advisor at USAID. Second, he holds a PhD in soil science from Washington State University. And third, and very interestingly, I hope we'll hear more about this, a National Geographic Society explorer. So terrific to have you with us, Dr. Glover, and we'll invite you to the podium. Please welcome Dr. Glover.
Thanks, David. And just to echo what he said about the great work that the consortium has done, and Majit and Max setting this up, I'm very pleased to be here and grateful that they brought me in. I was here, I believe, in 2008, so it's great to come back and see a lot of familiar faces and catch up. It's not often I get to come to the interior of the country now that I'm working at AID. I typically go overseas, so it was a great opportunity for me. I want to just talk this morning very briefly, about the sustainable intensification investments at USAID through our agricultural research investments. It's part of the research strategy that supports the Feed the Future initiative. After that, I'm going to focus in on a specific case study, a farmer and her farm in Malawi, to try and bring together some of the different components that we heard about yesterday. First, though, on our research program at USAID supporting the Feed the Future initiative, the most important thing to know is there's a nice website. It's easily navigable, and on there is a link to our research strategy overall. Within the research strategy, we have a Food Security Innovation Center that supports 7 different broad programs on, for example, safe and nutritious foods, specific commodities, and one of those 7 program areas is the program in sustainable intensification. And really in that, we're trying to integrate the different components of research in a coherent research program, primarily focused in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. Some of the example programs in there, I'm sure some of you are familiar with them, are SANREM Innovation Lab that's been going for 10 years now, the IPM Innovation Lab. We also have some CGIAR-led programs such as Africa Rising, that's Africa Research and Sustainable Intensification for the Next Generation, and it's sort of sister program in South Asia, the Cereal Systems Initiative in South Asia. So we're trying to bring those into a coherent framework under the program in sustainable intensification. And ultimately, we're hoping to identify pathways out of poverty and malnutrition for smallholder farmers, particularly for the women and children in those systems, through sustainable intensification strategies. So there's a heavy focus, of course, on increasing productivity, not just of a single crop, but really of the whole system. But it's not just about productivity increases. It's also about nutrition and income. As we all know, in some cases, you can increase productivity without increasing profitability, or you can increase productivity without having positive impacts on nutrition. So it's a complex set of issues to address comprehensively in a whole farming system. So that's one of the reasons I want to bring in a specific case study to show how these many different issues and components can ideally be brought together on the ground. But just to back up a little bit on the concept of sustainable intensification, in some ways it's a synthesis of the turf battles of the 1980s and earlier in the agronomy world between the more ecologically based approaches to agriculture versus production agriculture. And it really does capture, I think, the best of both of those concepts bringing together the idea that we do need to increase productivity, but with a heavy emphasis on preserving and conserving the natural resources and great awareness of the social, economic, political context in which these farming systems are being played out. Much of our research focuses on the direct inputs in terms of our on-the-ground research, so looking at the biophysical conditions in which labor inputs, off-farm inputs can help increase productivity, but also the better utilization of resources on farm. And so by sustainable intensification, three broad areas have been focused on: ecological intensification, whereby we're capturing more of the sunlight, more of the soil resources, more of the water; genetic intensification, whereby we're taking advantage of the advances in crop improvement, disease resistance, and so on. And then perhaps in most cases, one of the most important elements of sustainable intensification is the socioeconomic intensification, where we're linking farmers to other farmers, we're linking farmers to markets, we're providing a supportive environment for them to make their own choices, giving them a better picture of what's possible on their farm, and providing these baskets of options from which they can choose based on their own current resources, positions, and what they hope for in the future. And again, general outputs, production, increased production, better income, and better nutritional status. I'd also actually add in there, I think one of the things that we're seeing when successful are opportunities and livelihoods as outputs. Improved livelihoods in ways that we hadn't originally envisioned, and opportunities not just for the generation of farmers that we're working with, but for the next generation. I think that you'll see some of that in the case study I lay out. Now, in terms of, yesterday Ken said we need to increase production but also cut environmental problems in half. Well, some of the sustainability measures that we're looking at get to how do we know when something is sustainable or on the trajectory to sustainability? And of course, that's a big issue. When we're working in research, we're working on typically fairly short time frames, and we're often working at plot, field, or farm scales that really aren't large enough scales to robustly capture the full meaning of sustainability. So how do we constrain the definitions of sustainability so that we're able to actually operationalize it, make decisions based on what we see in the farm field? So those are kind of the complex issues that we're dealing with, and much of that is laid out in the Montpellier panel report from 2013. That's readily available online. So now let's go to Malawi. This is in the Dedza district. And I like Malawi as an example of what we can do with sustainable intensification, some of the challenges. Malawi has a very high population density. Land pressures are tremendous. Many of the smallholder farmers that we're working with are working from a half hectare to 1 hectare. Not a lot of options when you're working from that. And to secure food for their families, they're primarily focused on maize. So we often see just a continuous maize system with very little diversity and very little options. Ken Castman pointed out yesterday, if you grow a green manure crop, that means that that piece of land is not in maize. And if you have to grow maize, you cannot grow that green manure crop in the traditional rotation of green manure, maize, and so on. So you have to come up with strategies that support the higher productivity of maize each year. Also, as we'll see, there are many other challenges that have to be addressed simultaneously. So again, it's not just on production. These, I should say, these photographs are taken by a great friend of mine, Jim Richardson, Small World Gallery in Lindsborg, Kansas. He was with me on this trip. I meant to put those credits on the bottom, so anyway, as you'll see, these photos are taken in May, right before harvest. They were going to harvest that crop right after we left. But the farmer here is actually quite typical of many of the smallholder farmers we work with. Rhoda, she supports a fairly large family on about 1 hectare of farmland. She does grow somewhat of a diversity of crops. Her main fields, though, are dedicated to maize. She does also produce, though, pigs, goats, and chickens. Oftentimes, there's not a lot of livestock in these Malawi farming systems, so it's a bit of a story right there of how she brought in these livestock. So back in about 1994, Rhoda was growing some food just to supply some basic needs for the family. Her husband was working off farm, bringing in most of the money for school fees, improvements to the family, and so on. When he died, she was essentially left with very poor land, very degraded land, and the need to not only provide for the basic food needs without really outside income supplementation for that, and somehow to come up with the money for school fees. So she essentially suddenly assumed the total family's responsibilities based on a fairly poorly performing farm. The piece of land that she was allotted and had been working from was essentially unproductive. A few bags of maize each year, and largely due to really poor soil fertility conditions. The soils in those areas are inherently poor, and then they've been further degraded through continual nutrient mining, farmers taking off more nutrients each year than what they're replacing. Essentially, she was on the brink of what Ken Castman referred to as this downward spiral. Excuse me, I have a bit of hay fever this morning, so I'm kind of snorting up here. But so soil degradation has led to low productivity, and that really reduces options. Eventually, if she didn't recover from this downward spiral, you're looking at farm loss. They're displaced from their farm. The land, unproductive, becomes abandoned, and then you run into a food crisis. So really, Rhoda and her situation is marginal for sustainable intensification efforts to lift her out. She's just up against an awful lot, right? However, she, on her own initiative, David referred to his mother as the goddess of strategy, and I think that really resonated with me in thinking about Rhoda. She really did look around, take full advantage of the opportunities available. She began restoring her soil, boosted her yields over time, reached food security, and that's important. That we're not talking about income security, we're talking about food security. And then after that, she could focus more on income security, breaking into more higher value enterprises such as livestock. And then, of course, that's where you get more options in improving livelihoods and really looking for the next generation to provide them opportunities. So going back to 94, when this land was essentially non-productive, she knew she couldn't grow enough maize on it, so she began growing pigeon peas and ground nuts to restore some of the soil fertility and get a bit more nitrogen cycling back in there. And of course, then it was so unproductive she couldn't really afford costly inputs such as for fertilizer to boost it. At the time, an NGO was going around in a USAID-funded program with a tree planting program, primarily leguminous trees, to do just what Rhoda was looking to do, essentially restore soil fertility and boost productivity. So in a way, she developed a successional system using very fast-growing legumes like groundnuts, slower growing but productive legumes like pigeon peas, and then the much longer-term trees that she planted. One of the more interesting ones is Phyderbia albida. It has this reverse phenology. When the maize is growing, there are no leaves on the trees. During the dry season, the tree has leaves, and then right before maize planting, the leaves fall from the trees, providing a good source of fertility for that new maize crop. They're slower growing, so it takes a while to get them in place. There's some other trees, Tephrosia, Gliricidia with different characteristics, different nitrogen and growth rates and so on, that she used sort of in a successional manner to get early, medium, and long-term benefits. And I thought it was pretty extraordinary when I saw it. This was actually one of the more elegant cases of resource sharing that I've seen in a farming system. You can see how close those maize plants are planted right up next to that Fiderbia albida. Again, when the maize is growing, that tree is shut down. And when the tree is growing, the maize isn't growing. And those maize plants right next to the tree had beautiful ears of corn on them. Pretty extraordinary complementary use of resources. What Rhoda was essentially doing was extending the rooting depth of her whole system and extending the solar capture of her system. So she was pumping biomass into that system pretty much all year round, rather than just in the narrow window during which the maize was growing. So pumping energy below ground and capturing sunlight. If we go below ground, you'll see what I'm talking about. So you see the maize roots actually growing right out into the cornfield, providing nitrogen, but also, importantly, providing some physical benefits to the soil. I don't know if you can see it very well, but right in here is a dense layer, root restricting layer, that without those tree roots punching down through it, you really are, you're restricting your cropping system to about 6 inches to 12 inches of topsoil. She now has access through these trees to many meters of nutrients and potentially water. Her water flow through the system is much better now. Water soaking into the soil, being used, it's not running off. So she has not only a nutrient bank built up now, but a water bank, which is extremely important. By the way, that's her granddaughter there, Ratifa. She has few children left due to the ravages of disease and so on. So, again, she's still very much up against it, and it's interesting how hard she's working for her grandchildren's future. Now, interestingly, a lot of, in the past, the sort of ecological agriculture community and the production agriculture community didn't see much overlap. But now, through the concept of sustainable intensification, we see the opportunities for getting that ecological foundation built and actually enabling farmers to connect into the more, I guess you'd call it the more intensification process by using the nutrients that they're bringing in, by using the improved varieties that they're buying and paying for in a much better way. And we do see studies showing that when you get these much more ecologically, higher ecologically functioning systems in place, then you can actually get higher returns on your investments in fertilizers and seeds. That's the demand side. That's when farmers are willing to invest in these costly inputs. So some 15 years later, Rhoda is now producing good yields, about 5 tons per hectare. I think on average, it sounded from talking to her, she's probably reliably producing 3 to 5 tons per hectare of maize, and that's enough to supply her family with maize, and in most years more to sell. Now, of course, maize doesn't have a high value. So again, I think she's looking at this in two different levels. One is secure food for the family. That's the maize. But maize isn't going to lift her out of poverty on a 1 hectare farm. So she has to look for other, how can she leverage that for other sources of income? And of course, one of the best ways to do that, and I think the comments yesterday bore this out, livestock is a very valuable enterprise for many farmers to go into. And it's through her investments in livestock, her intensification efforts in livestock, that she's now able to put her grandchildren through school, buy some of the things that make their lives better. Salt, for example, but also, of course, clothes, improving the shelter and so on. Now, I think it's doubtful that many people adopt strategies like agroforestry for the soil benefits alone. I think that's a pretty hard sell. If it's only for the improved soil management, I think it takes too long, and the benefits aren't seen soon enough. But if you can, in the first few years, get additional benefits like livestock fodder, then that's an added incentive to adopt that. And Rhoda actually started using the weeds on field margins within the fields after the growing season, plant material just from around her homestead to use as livestock feed. So essentially she was putting together these sources of feed and increasing the nutrients cycling through that system. So previously she wasn't collecting the weeds around the field margin, so that was kind of a loss of nutrients to her overall system. So really leveraging the resources on her farm in a much better way by going into the livestock enterprises. There you'll see she's drying some maize bran. She takes her maize into a mill, gets it processed, and she gets maize bran to feed to her livestock. And there's the Gliricidia leaves that she's harvested. The branches that she's harvested, she lets them dry out for a half a day or a day to improve their palatability. And that's, by the way, her grandson Boniface. And of course, she has incorporated those additional nutrients back into her farm field for actually even further improving the nutrient status, the physical and biological components of the soil. And you'll see the tremendous amount of crop residue on the farm field. Both of her neighbors on either side, the fields at that time, the soils at that time were just bare. Hard, bare. You could imagine a heavy rain coming and most of the water being lost. I could distinguish about 3 years of crop residues in different levels of decomposition in Rhoda's field. She lays those stalks down. She's able to do that because she has alternate sources of livestock feed now that are actually more nutritious than maize stalks. So this is a really important component to intensifying, getting that soil protected, ensuring that all the water is going into the soil rather than running off. That's kind of a big breakthrough for a lot of people in these farming systems that remove the crop residues either for their own livestock or to sell as fodder. Now again, if we think about the full livelihoods of these folks, fuel wood, cooking fuel is of course very critical. They're either spending a lot of capital, a lot of money, or a lot of time getting fuel wood. Well, if you're producing it right there on your farm, it really reduces your costs on that end. And of course, for the larger landscape in general, it's more sustainable. She's not buying illegally harvested fuel wood as much. She may still be supplementing it, but she's relying much more on her own farm resources. And I think that's an important point. When we talk about cutting the environmental impact of farming systems, I think we're really going to have to look at the multifunctional options. If we have an intervention that does only one thing, it's much less likely to be adopted and adopted, especially for the long term. So the other aspect that's very important for USAID is this nutritional component. You can see her putting very refined maize in and boiling it up for their main dish, but she can now supplement it with meat and fruit. She grows mango trees and some of the vegetables. And of course, that's what we're hoping for, improved livelihoods, increased income, reducing the risk to failure based upon a single year's crop failure, increased resilience, and of course the nutritional advantages that come to the children that afford them the greater ability to perform in the future. So just thinking back to that virtuous cycle, really, I think that's a critical thing is we're not going to lift folks like Rhoda out of poverty immediately or provide them with whole new trajectories to shoot off on. But I think we really can offer some opportunities for their family as a whole to, especially for those next generation. Maybe Retifa wants to take over the farm. She can do that now, very likely. And Boniface, maybe he wants to go to the city and do something entirely different, go off to school. They're in school, so that's a great opportunity for all of them. Now that's a bit of a idealistic picture, and we can say that anecdotes are limited because it's a single case. But I think it gives us a lot of insight into how these pieces can be put together. Now there are some concerns. You know, if Rhoda's health were to fail, this might all fall apart very easily. I will say, even then, at least that bit of land is protected and improved and doesn't become abandoned like it would have in the past. So, I mean, building this as at the community level and at the regional level, I think helps in terms of achieving regional food security overall. Now, you know, I don't want to focus too much on the benefits of agroforestry. There are other strategies in sustainable intensification. Some colleagues of mine and I described some in this publication. This is a photograph, for example, of a doubled up legume system in which farmers grow soybeans in an understory of pigeon peas to double the nitrogen fixation, double the carbon capture. And it's a very complementary system, again, using resources at different times and different depths, really able to boost the subsequent maize crop yields, reduce fertilizer use, and so on. So there's a bit more information at that. And I will say, Rhoda's situation was pretty complex. They're not all that complex, and not every farmer has the same objectives. Just down the road, about a half a mile from Rhoda's place, Mavuto had a very nice field of maize, and we talked to him. We could see that he was growing Gliricidia, one of these leguminous shrubs in his field, and his maize looked terrific, so we talked to him. He's not interested in having big trees in his field. He doesn't want to intensify into livestock. Most of his time is spent in off-farm labor, so he's getting good income from that. So he's really using his farm as a supplementary income. And he has some very, very clear objectives that we can also assist with in terms of introducing new improved crop varieties, maybe a bit better fertilizer formulation, and so on. So we have to remember there's quite a range of typologies out there, and addressing some of these ag development needs in terms of what the farmers themselves want rather than just one simple package that fits everybody's needs. And I think we have a few minutes now, so I hope gives some picture of how we can integrate these on the ground. And there's, of course, many examples out there, so I'd be happy to take any questions or comments. Okay.
Morning. Mark Westgate, Iowa State University. I just have a quick question about how the lady farmer got the idea to try the things she did.
Yeah, and this goes back to that idea of socioeconomic intensification. She really did link into other farmer groups, but also some of the development programs around. For example, in the livestock, she participated in a heifer international-like program where she got a pig. In the first litter, she has to pass on a pig. So she was linking herself into these different programs to really help her out. She was also very well linked into extension services. She had a good relationship with the local extension person. You know, give him some food when he comes by. He'll come by more often. things like that. And that's part of that socioeconomic intensification component, which is probably about the most important. All right, thank you all so much.